There was a moment in your life when something quietly changed, even if you didn't recognize it at the time. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in a subtle shift that slowly altered the direction of everything you were experiencing. It felt like life became heavier without explanation, like situations that once flowed easily began to resist you, and people you trusted started acting differently without clear reason. What you thought was coincidence may have actually been a sequence of aligned disruptions, each one placed at a specific emotional pressure point. You may remember days when your peace disappeared without warning, when your thoughts became louder than your answers, and when your future felt like it was slipping out of reach without you doing anything wrong. But what if that was not randomness at all? What if it was a hidden pattern of pressure designed to test what you would become under strain? The strange timing of losses, the unexpected closures, the emotional exhaustion that seemed to arrive in waves, none of it matched normal life patterns, yet it all formed a consistent direction. Disruption at the exact moment you were about to expand. And the most unsettling part is that it didn't feel like attack. It felt like confusion. That is what made it so powerful. Because confusion makes you question yourself instead of questioning the process happening around you. You started asking, why me, instead of why now? And that shift in questioning changed how you perceived everything. But beneath all of it, something deeper was unfolding, a silent repositioning that you were never told about. And even now, you may not realize that the version of you that entered that season is not the same one reading this today. Something in your timeline bent, shifted, and redirected itself in ways you still don't fully understand. And the reason it happened is far more intentional than it first appeared. What if everything that started breaking around you was not random collapse, but carefully timed pressure designed to expose what you were built from? There were moments when your life didn't just feel difficult, it felt arranged in a way that made no emotional sense, as if each challenge arrived exactly when your strength was already low, and each disappointment followed a pattern you could not predict. People may have called it bad luck, coincidence, or timing, but deep down you felt something different, the strange repetition of emotional weight that never fully stopped long enough for you to recover. Situations ended just when you were adjusting, conversations shifted just when you were opening up, and opportunities disappeared just when you finally believed again. It created a silent exhaustion, not from one event, but from a sequence of events that seemed to understand your weakest points better than you did. And the most confusing part was that nothing looked obviously connected on the surface, yet everything felt connected in experience. That is where the invisible force reveals itself, not as something visible, but as a pattern of pressure that shapes perception itself. Because when pressure becomes consistent enough, it stops looking like separate problems and starts feeling like your identity is the problem. You begin to question your stability, your decisions, even your worth, without realizing that the environment around you has been systematically removing your sense of grounding. But what you didn't see at the time is that breakdown is not always destruction, it can be forced recalibration. A hidden reset, where what cannot support your next level is pulled away through discomfort instead of explanation. And even though it felt like you were losing control, something deeper was actually stripping away illusions you depended on, forcing you into a version of awareness you would never have reached in comfort. There was a point in your story where, logically, everything should have collapsed completely, where the pressure, the losses, and the emotional weight should have finally pushed you past the limit. Yet somehow you are still here, reading this, still standing in a timeline that should have taken a different direction. Think back to that period when one more setback would have broken your final layer of patience, when one more disappointment should have ended your motivation, when one more emotional hit should have made you disconnect entirely. That was not an ordinary phase of life. It was a convergence point where multiple outcomes were possible, and yet only one reality unfolded: your continuation. The strange part is that there were moments when everything aligned toward failure, when circumstances seemed mathematically certain to end in collapse, and then something shifted at the last possible second. A delay you didn't ask for, a door that didn't fully close, a decision you didn't plan to make, or an interruption that seemed too small to matter at the time, but changed everything. At first, you may have called it luck or coincidence, but over time the pattern becomes harder to ignore. What should have escalated didn't. What should have finished you didn't reach completion, and what looked irreversible suddenly lost its momentum. It's almost as if the outcome was paused at the exact threshold where damage becomes final and redirected into something less absolute. And the most overlooked detail is not what happened to you, but what didn't happen. Because in many cases, survival is defined not by dramatic rescue, but by silent prevention. You never saw the full version of what was about to unfold, but something in the structure of events broke its own progression. And now, looking back, you are not just someone who endured a difficult season, you are someone who passed through a moment where ending was possible, but did not become your reality. And that single difference changes the entire meaning of your story going forward. You may still wonder why you didn't fully collapse during everything you went through, especially in the moments when your mind was overloaded, your emotions were stretched thin, and your sense of direction felt almost completely gone. On the surface, it may look like you simply held on, but what actually happened runs deeper than endurance alone. There was a layer of resistance inside you that didn't activate through comfort or certainty. It activated under pressure, when everything familiar started to disappear at once. That is why, even in your lowest moments, something in you refused to fully surrender, even when you could not logically explain why. It wasn't that the pain was lighter for you than others. It was that something within you was structured differently in response to it. While parts of your life were breaking down, another part of you was quietly adapting, learning how to function without stability, how to think without clarity, and how to continue moving without emotional support. That hidden adaptation is what prevented total collapse. And over time, what felt like survival became something closer to transformation in real time. You didn't just endure events, you were being reshaped by them in ways you couldn't perceive while they were happening. Even your silence, your withdrawal, your overthinking, and your emotional exhaustion were not signs of weakness in the way you may have believed. They were signs of a system under reconstruction. Because when external support disappears, internal structure either breaks completely or rebuilds itself in a stronger configuration. In your case, something refused to let the system shut down entirely. You adapted, recalibrated, and continued operating even when nothing around you felt stable enough to rely on. And that is the real reason you didn't break completely, not because nothing hurt you, but because something inside you learned how to survive in conditions where most versions of you would have stopped functioning long before reaching this point. There was a point in your life when things didn't just change, they silently redirected, as if your entire timeline was rewritten without any announcement or permission, and the strange part is that you only started noticing it much later, when certain people disappeared, certain paths stopped responding, and certain opportunities that once felt guaranteed suddenly no longer fit your direction. At the time, it may have felt like random loss or unfortunate timing, but when you look deeper, it begins to resemble something more structured, like a sequence of events that consistently removed you from environments you were no longer meant to grow in. The connections that once defined your identity started weakening, not all at once, but gradually enough that you adapted without realizing you were being moved out of alignment. Even your goals began to shift, not because you abandoned them, but because something inside you stopped resonating with who you used to be. And that is where the timeline rewrite begins. Not in dramatic moments, but in subtle replacements of desire, direction, and emotional attachment. What once felt essential started feeling unnecessary, and what once felt out of reach started feeling irrelevant. It's almost like your internal compass was recalibrated while your external world was still catching up. You may have called it confusion, but confusion is often what it feels like when two versions of your life overlap, the one you expected and the one you are quietly being moved into. And during that overlap, certain doors closed, not to block you, but to prevent you from returning to a version of life that no longer matches your evolution. Even the setbacks that frustrated you most may have been part of that silent correction, forcing detours that protected you from staying too long in spaces that were shrinking your potential. Now, looking back, you can start to see the pattern forming, not of randomness, but of redirection that only makes sense when viewed from a distance. And the most powerful realization is this: your life didn't stop moving forward. It simply stopped moving in the direction you originally expected, because something within your path had already been rewritten long before you became aware of it. What you went through was not only a sequence of external events, it was an internal transformation that happened so gradually you didn't recognize it while it was unfolding. On the surface, it may feel like you were simply dealing with stress, loss, or uncertainty, but beneath that layer, something far more profound was restructuring how you think, react, and perceive reality itself. The version of you that entered that difficult phase relied heavily on external validation, predictable outcomes, and emotional stability as reference points for safety. But over time, those reference points started disappearing one by one. And in that disappearance, something unexpected began to develop. A different kind of awareness that does not depend on constant reassurance. You started noticing things you used to ignore, sensing shifts in people's behavior faster, questioning situations more deeply, and responding less impulsively to emotional triggers that once controlled your decisions. It didn't happen as a sudden breakthrough. It happened through repetition, pressure, and adaptation. Every moment of confusion forced your mind to build new pathways. Every disappointment forced emotional recalibration, and every silent period forced you to sit with yourself in ways you once avoided. And while it may have felt like stagnation or emotional fatigue at the time, it was actually the formation of a more resilient internal structure. You became less reactive, not because you stopped caring, but because you began processing differently. You started separating emotion from interpretation, experience from identity, and outcome from self-worth. That shift is subtle, but it is irreversible once it stabilizes. Even your intuition became sharper, not because something was added to you, but because noise was gradually removed. And now, when you look back at situations that once overwhelmed you, there is a quiet realization that you would not respond the same way today. Not because the world changed, but because you did. This is the internal upgrade no one talks about. Not a sudden empowerment, but a slow restructuring of perception that turns chaos into clarity and pressure into long-term intelligence that stays with you long after the storm has passed. There comes a phase after prolonged pressure where nothing around you looks dramatically different at first, yet internally everything begins to align in a quieter, more precise way, as if the chaos that once defined your experience is slowly losing its control over your perception. You may not be able to point to a single event and call it a breakthrough, but you start noticing small signs that your reality is responding to you differently than before. Situations that once felt blocked begin to feel slightly more open. Conversations carry more clarity than confusion, and your decisions start landing with a sense of internal certainty you didn't have during your earlier phases. This is not sudden success, it is preparation becoming visible. And the most important part is that it does not arrive as external validation first. It arrives as internal stability that no longer collapses under uncertainty. You begin to notice that what used to trigger emotional disruption now passes through you without the same intensity, as if your system has learned how to absorb pressure without fracturing. Even your timing feels different, less forced, less reactive, more aligned with what unfolds naturally instead of what you used to chase. This is often the stage where people think nothing is happening, when in reality, everything is repositioning beneath the surface. Because breakthrough rarely announces itself as arrival. It builds itself as alignment until the shift becomes undeniable. You are no longer operating from confusion, but from a quieter form of knowing that does not require constant reassurance. And although you may still be in between what ended and what has not yet fully begun, there is a distinct feeling that the old cycles no longer have access to you in the same way they once did. This is the beginning of momentum returning, but in a form that is more stable, more intentional, and more connected to who you have become rather than who you used to be. And even if you cannot see the full outcome yet, something inside you already recognizes that the direction you are moving in is no longer random. It is forming into something inevitable. At some point in reflection, everything you went through starts to connect in a way that no longer feels like scattered suffering, but like a structured sequence that was guiding you through layers of experience you would never have chosen consciously. The losses, the delays, the emotional weight, and even the moments of confusion begin to form a pattern that suggests direction rather than disorder, even if that direction was invisible while you were living it. What once felt like unfair interruption starts to resemble necessary removal, and what once felt like endings start to look like forced transitions away from versions of life that could not sustain who you were becoming. It is only from distance that the meaning begins to surface, because while you were inside the experience, you were focused on surviving each moment rather than understanding the architecture behind it. And yet, when you step back mentally, you can start to see how certain experiences built resilience, how certain disappointments built awareness, and how certain isolations created space for internal clarity that noise would have never allowed. The most difficult realization is that the version of you were trying to protect was not the version meant to continue forward. Something in your path required dismantling, not as punishment, but as preparation for a structure you could not have built while holding on to old stability. Even the questions you were left with were part of that process, because uncertainty forces deeper awareness than comfort ever could. And although it may still be difficult to assign simple meaning to complex experiences, there is a quiet recognition forming that nothing you went through was wasted in the way it once felt. Instead, it functioned as a series of corrections, realignments, and internal reorganizations that slowly shaped you into someone capable of handling a different level of existence. And now, as the pattern becomes clearer, the final understanding is not that everything was easy to accept, but that everything, in its own way, was part of a progression you could only recognize once you had already moved through it. If you are still here, it means something in you didn't just listen to this. It responded to it, even if silently, even if without full explanation yet. Because recognition does not always arrive as certainty. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet feeling that something you've lived through finally has language. And now you stand at a different point than where you began this message, not because the outside world has fully changed in this instant, but because your internal perception of it no longer fits the old narrative you used to carry. That is what activation actually looks like. Not an explosion of change, but a shift in how you relate to everything that once defined your limitations. You may still have questions, and you may still feel like you are in between phases, but something important has already happened. You can no longer fully return to the version of you that believed everything was random, meaningless, or permanent in the way it once felt. There is now awareness where there used to be confusion, and observation where there used to be emotional collapse. And that shift alone changes the direction of everything that comes next. Because once perception changes, response patterns change, and once response patterns change, life stops repeating itself in the same way it used to. This is the point where many people unconsciously hesitate, because awareness brings responsibility. The responsibility to no longer ignore what you now see, to no longer abandon what you now understand about yourself, and to no longer reduce your experience to something smaller than what it actually shaped you into. And so the real activation is not something given to you from outside. It is something you acknowledge internally when you decide that your story is no longer defined by what broke you, but by what you became inside it. If you recognize even a fraction of this in your own experience, then this is your turning point. Not because everything is instantly solved, but because you are no longer operating from the same internal identity that created the old outcomes. And from here, every step you take carries a different weight, a different awareness, and a different direction than anything that came before it.